This week has been all about the stars and anniversaries, so a good combination of the two is releasing an episode all about the PBS program Cosmos on the anniversary of its creator and host, Carl Sagan's birthday. This is the EPS Podcast, and I'm glad to have you listening. James Maynard, the host of the Cosmic Companion podcast, draws a direct line from watching Cosmos when it first aired in 1980 to his career as a writer, astronomer, historian, and scientist. And since I can do the same with another PBS series that came out 10 years later, Ken Burns' The Civil War, we made for a perfect pair of analysts of how a documentary series can be looked at as a primary source of its era. Welcome back to the EPS Podcast, where everything is a primary source. I'm Eric Paul, and I'm excited today because I'm being joined by James Maynard, who is, among other things, you've been named a top writer for space, science, technology, history, and future by Medium.com. And for a while now, you've been hosting a podcast called The Cosmic Companion. And I'm so glad you could join the EPS Podcast today. I'm sure there's plenty more that I've left out in that brief introduction, but one of the things that I sometimes struggle with is getting right to the interviews. So I wanted to invite you on right away, and welcome to the Everything is a Primary Source podcast.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's fabulous being here, and I'm here for the journey. Let's take it together.
That's awesome. So as it usually happens, when I contact somebody through, the various, podcaster, Facebook pages and groups and stuff like that, for my show, which is about everything. We usually toss ideas back and forth about what we can, especially pop culture wise, what we can go over. And the two that we narrowed down, we said, all right, we could either do something with Jules Verne, and the birth of science fiction writing. But you leaned more towards, and I was all on board with this, Carl Sagan's Cosmos, the TV documentary. And what is it about that program that said, yep, that's it, that's our topic?
Right. It's the legacy of Cosmos, both the book and the TV series, both of which were groundbreaking in so many ways. And the fact that the influence of both of those combined works has influenced a generation of scientists around the globe.
Yeah.
It inspired me as a child, and I'm trying to live out the next dream of where I think Carl would be today if he were alive. If he were alive.
Yeah, his career and especially his media presence was, like you said, it was groundbreaking, and also he bridged a lot of gaps. It seems like that he brought the scientific world, and particularly astronomy, into our homes, quite literally, with the series.
Right.
But also just, because I think, given the time period that it came out, 1980, we're about a decade removed from man landing on the moon. And the Apollo mission was exciting for people, of course. It was, but it seemed like more the popular culture aspect of it was more just the achievement of landing a man on the moon, and less the scientific exploration aspects of the Apollo mission. Most people weren't really too interested or too concerned, with the actual experiments they might be doing, or the evidence that they're collecting to bring back. And so, after that era goes away, people are focused on earthly things for a while. And then with Cosmos, it's a combination of both, isn't it?
It is. And I think you bring up a very good point. And that is sometimes one of the challenges we have as, science educators, as scientists, as people who are trying to bring about a better world through education and knowledge is that there is an apparent chasm between the general public and scientists.
Right.
All right. And Carl was a mastermind at building bridges across that chasm. And Cosmos did that in the sense that, he used the best technology of his time, which was television and magnificent, nearly, coffee table books, full of stunning images. And so when he talked about Mars, he wasn't just saying, he wasn't in a classroom for the most part, talking about what it would be like to be on Mars. And there's roughly a 25% concentration of, ferric oxide in the surface, blah, 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 blah. He stood on Mars and said, look around me.
Right.
Let's walk up to the Viking spacecraft, and that engages people on a level that more standoffish third party reports just can't do.
Yeah. And it's the ultimate in popular culture because it still stands as the most viewed public broadcasting program of all time. It was, and so it predates me. I didn't see it because I wasn't born yet when it came out. I was born a year later, but I am certain that I had a class in college that the professor used the series as the basis for the course. And if I'm not mistaken, the class was called In Search of Meaning. And it wasn't an astronomy class. I think it was a philosophy class. And if I'm not mistaken, I know it was Carl Sagan, and so I'm pretty sure it's Cosmos that we watched. And so like every other class, at least once a week, we'd watch an episode and then we'd spend the rest of the week discussing, the kinds of things that he brought up. And it was actually me going to that class is when I learned about 9/11. It was, I was walking across campus on September 11th and it was, quiet. And I was like, what's going on? Where is everybody? Just to kind of speak to the way communication was still kind of slow in 2001, that I had to walk into this classroom and because, so that's my connection to it is because I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's an episode where he goes to Afghanistan, right? Doesn't he cover something to do with some of and it was like a week or two after 9/11 that we watched that episode. I remember, kids in the class kind of, gasps when he mentions Afghanistan because that was all over the news, of course, because that's where the attacks had emanated from. So that's my connection with Cosmos is that I remember it in, it was shown 21 years after it came out and it was still relevant. Wow. That he was still using it as a teaching tool. And if I remember correctly, I think the professor even kind of looked like Carl Sagan. Like obviously it wasn't him because he passed away by 1996. But he had that similar, and to go what you were saying before about bridging the gap, he has kind of like a dashing appearance, like when he was on the screen, he's very comfortable in front of the camera. He's not, uncomfortable in any way. He seems to kind of fit, TV presenter, but he's also a brilliant mind, at the same time.
Right. Absolutely. And actually I dressed as Carl Sagan one Halloween. I kid you not.
That's how did that? What was the basis for that? Turtleneck?
Basically a pair of chinos, turtleneck, tweed suit jacket, carrying a copy of Cosmos, our sleek package.
Right. And
so yeah, he had just beyond his appearance though, he had a personality that was engaging. He is the type of person you'd want at your dinner table. And
that I think is a good segue to the primary source analysis form that I use for all of these things. And I think this is the first documentary that I've done on my show as a primary source. And because, the first question that comes up, and for those of you tuning in for the first time to the EPS podcast, what I have is a template of questions where once we answer that, the questions on the left side of the template, it will tell us something about the time period on the right side, which would be the turn of the 70s into the 80s. So the first question is the material. What material is it made from, and or how is it made? And so this show really couldn't have happened without Carl Sagan, because he wrote it and presented it, and he wrote the companion book to it. Do you think that had he not done all of that, would anybody else have been able to make something comparable in that time period?
That's a great question. I mean, extraordinary people are by definition rare, or extremely rare. I mean, Isaac Asimov was alive at the time, and, another one of my, favorite authors, when I was age 8, 9, around that time. And and I'm trying to think if there was some, but I mean, possibly Aaron certainly has a lot of writing talent. And I would say it is possible, but not probable.
Right. Because like we were saying before, the material is, it's obviously, it's the cosmos, it's astronomy, it's the ever expanding universe, but it's also, each episode touches on either history or present day, for 1980, or, contemporary issues, or, time honored traditions that are, and he creates that link. So I think, that's how it was made. And really only Sagan could have, had that mindset, I think, to put it that way, that, he would do that. And I think I have, going back to Star Wars, Star Wars was fresh, 77, 80. And so many people, mistakenly label Star Wars as science fiction. It's not. It has nothing to do with science. It has, it's a completely fictional galaxy. Nothing about it is actually work. It wouldn't work. You can't travel planet to planet like you're driving a car from town to town. And George Lucas never said this was science fiction. He's like, it's fantasy, it's space opera. But because it was such a huge cultural phenomenon, I'm curious if that was one of the reasons that prompted, the scientific community to say, we need something to kind of take science back. We need to take space back. It's not just a setting for, the Force, and for, it is a real thing, and we can dazzle people with reality, just as much as you can with, Star Wars.
Yeah. And, you're touching on the other topic that we had talked about a little bit, is that, science fiction has always been divided into the more scientific, side, which started, with Verne. And, and is now probably best represented by Star Trek, or the more fantastical side, which, where we have H.G. Wells and Star Wars hanging out.
Right. Yeah. And those ones, you can kind of give somewhat of a pass to, Verne and Wells, because, they, it's like where science is and the discoveries that are made and what is hard science constantly changes. They had only so much knowledge that they could have had. They couldn't even conceptualize a lot of it.
Right. But Verne tried.
Yeah.
Wells was just like, I don't know, metachlorians.
Yeah, exactly. He would have come up with that, definitely.
But I was going to say, not only do you have Star Wars coming out, and I think it was 77.
Yeah.
But you have Star Trek, the motion picture, coming out roughly 2 years later.
Right.
And Star Trek had been around, since 65, 66, something like that. And people had developed, Star Trek had developed a cult following.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Type of thing. And it had already begun to inspire science.
Right.
The first non-orbital, version of the space shuttle was named Enterprise.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was going to say that too, because we're like 1980 is not the 80s because they hadn't happened yet.
No.
It's the last year of the 70s. And that's right. Also when the space shuttle program is literally lifting off. And so it's, and space shuttle, it was quite a bit different from the Apollo mission. What they were expecting to do. It was basically going to be, the idea behind space shuttle was that we're going to literally shuttle astronauts into space for a variety of different missions, whether to launch telescopes or to do, or bring them back and forth to space stations. And, it was very, it seemed like maybe a little bit too early, but it seemed like we are going to make space relevant to us. Sort of like what we've been seeing the last couple of years with, the billionaires going into outer space. The reason why they rationalize it by saying, well, we want to make sure that we can get to a place soon where going into outer space is on par with traveling across the world in an airplane. That it's not going to be, maybe not super pedestrian, but it's going to be for, pretty, well-off people will be able to. And then within a few generations, maybe we can make trips to the moon, more and more frequent. But, just digressing a bit, that was the turn of the 70s and 80s. It was like, we have space back on our minds, but let's make it, let's make
it. It almost seems like they were trying to make it utilitarian. Mm-hmm. In the sense of, let's have this thing as basically a space train,
right?
Ferrying things and people up and down and what have you in every which way. But the trouble is that does not really capture the human imagination.
You're right.
Go taking the first steps into space. Yuri Gagarin and John Glenn and those people, that captured the imagination because it's like we're lifting off of our home planet for the first time. And then going to the moon. My parents actually met on the Apollo project.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Because
what's up?
I mean, that's. I remember John F. Kennedy mentioning that the Apollo missions and everything, like when he was kind of telling the country about it, was going to employ tens of thousands of people, right? So they were some of those tens of thousands of people that worked on the Apollo project.
My dad was actually a subcontractor to NASA. He was an electronics genius. This guy was like, the professor from Gilligan's Island. He could, take two pieces, a piece from the radio and two turtle shells and make a nuclear reactor out of it, Oh, wow. Practically, it's a little. But he couldn't manage people to save his life. Mm-hmm. And he hired my mother, who was coming off of the Redstone program, who didn't have the electronics genius, but she knew how to manage people. So my dad had gotten this contract to design electronics for Apollo. That's how they met. Yada, yada, yada. Here I am. And
I was going to say, I mean, we on this program, I have, talked as human beings, individuals as being primary sources. So that means that you are actually a product of the Apollo mission.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because like if that hadn't happened and you're, parents didn't get their jobs, subcontracted jobs through that, or because of that, you wouldn't be here. So that's those seems like that's the kind of connections, maybe not that specific, but that seems to be the essence of Cosmos, really, right?
It is.
That, showing that, like, the threads that connect us all on Earth or beyond.
Right. And the episode where he goes into the children's classroom, I think it's the same one he attended.
Yeah, in Brooklyn. Yeah.
Yeah. And the connection the kids have with him, it's like he was like a child. He had the wonder of a child combined with the knowledge of one of the world's greatest scientists.
Yeah.
It's just astounding.
And that actually is a good place to bring us to the next question. I mean, we've obviously, by titling this Carl Sagan's Cosmos, we've indicated who made it, but the maker's status, a role or status in society, he has pretty humble origins. He does. He's not, and so in some ways, to kind of continue the Luke Skywalker narrative, he starts off and he goes off from this classroom in Brooklyn, New York, and accomplishes all of these things. He has, by the time he's making this program, he's a well-known scientist. He's a well-known astronomer. He's not like this isn't how he got his start, in other words. And so when he comes back, it's like his return. Like he said, he left, gained all this knowledge, gained all this insight, his brilliant mind at work. But then he comes back to his origin place and says, all right, I'm one of you again. Like I know what it was like being in this classroom, and I can tell you, how I got where I am, but also I'm never going to stop learning. This is never going to be, I can never say, I'm done, So what was some of the things that made him having that status in society? What were some of the projects that Carl Sagan had been working on leading up to this PBS program?
I mean, the fellow's a well-known educator and writer and author, but what I find interesting is what you had just mentioned. If you don't mind me taking this on a little bit of a tangent, so I think this is interesting. You talked about him having these humble beginnings and going away, but when he came back, in many ways, from the outside, he was changed. He was no longer a humble, kid growing up in Brooklyn. It was in some ways like the hero's journey.
Right. Yeah.
And it's that same story, told, by Joseph Campbell. And it's told, versions of this story are told, time and again throughout cultures around the world.
Yeah.
And Star Wars is a classic example.
Right.
A young farm boy gets swept up in events beyond his control and, goes away and eventually comes back, a changed person. And, he went from, Luke Skywalker went from, humble desert farm boy to Jedi Knight,
Right.
And
it's maybe it's just fresh in my mind because I was talking about it in my class today, but I think The Wizard of Oz is another great example of that. And it's very American.
Yeah.
And L. Frank Baum, I mean, I guess fantasy writer, obviously, because, Wizard of Oz has no basis in science. I don't think tornadoes tend to bring people to different worlds, but, when he wrote that book in 1900, in the introduction, he actually said, this is a new fairy tale for the new era. And then 40 years later, it's made into the movie The Wizard of Oz. And then 40 years, roughly 40 years, a few generations later, then you get to Star Wars. And it's the same story told again. And, connecting this back to, Star Wars again with Cosmos, I'm wondering that now, if my hypothesis I put forward a little while ago of, reclaiming space for the scientists. Maybe I should modify that a little bit and say perhaps it was being done as a collective, like you just said, the hero's journey. Like, this is an extension of the things, because one of the things that made Star Wars so successful in 1977 and get so much attention is because the 70s were so awful. And people, they wanted, they were so, their attention had left the skies and gone back to Earth. Their eyes were down on the ground. Stagflation, inflation, the Vietnam War, Watergate. It was a time of a lot of confusion and murkiness. And then you get the story that's so straightforward, good guys, bad guys, and heroes, villains, and taking those classic tropes like the hero's journey and just not even reinventing it, just representing it again. So I'm wondering if Cosmos, in a way, was like the documentary version of Star Wars. It's like, here is an extension of that. And 1980s, when the second Star Wars movie came out, The Empire Strikes Back, so it's still relevant. It's like one big package that came to the country and the world for the end of the 70s into the 80s.
Right. I think one thing we also have to consider is the television of the 1970s. First, Star Trek, which only ran for 3 seasons, but presented science fiction with science in mind, came to be popular among people. Then you have the animated series. Which was surprisingly good. I actually watched a couple episodes a couple of months ago.
Was it Hanna-Barbera that made that? I think, I don't know. The animation looks like it's really good animation. For the time. Yeah.
I think it was Hanna-Barbera. We get somebody, screaming about the Klingons.
That's like a Scooby-Doo type thing.
All right. So you also have, Star Trek, the motion picture.
Right.
Which came out, let's face it, wasn't the world's greatest film. But even that presented some interesting ideas. And you have the rise of, movements and social movements that are being driven in part by television at this time.
Absolutely.
Mary Tyler Moore, Rhoda, Alice, the Jeffersons.
Right.
And so I think that when Cosmos came about, it really was riding partly on this new understanding of science brought about, by the Apollo missions just a few years before. And it brought in a new understanding of ourselves in the sense that we are all one people,
right?
And one species, and I think that as you talk about it, the largely unfortunate events of the 1970s also may have given people a sense of, borrow the term, a sense of malaise.
Yeah.
And I think that Cosmos gave people at the time a sense of hope for the future.
Yeah. You're right about that. Yeah. And it was because you could very easily use the topics that he presents to almost, condescendingly tell humans about, how, little they are. I think about like the cosmic calendar and, the way that it's presented that way of like, if you were to make the entire history of the Earth and in the universe into 1 year, humans don't even show up until the last minute of December 31st.
Right.
And like, when you look at it that way, you're like, oh man, like this little podcast I'm doing, that's not even going to make a mark, but, so he could have done it that way. And, he wouldn't have gotten that many viewers. People would have been like, what's this guy's deal? But by having it, like you said, such an optimistic and unifying thing, because
Mhm.
yeah, not just the United States, but the whole world by 1980 was very fragmented. There was so many people, and media does its part in trying to unify, and that's going back to Star Wars. That was part of it. It was a human story. It wasn't it doesn't take place in any particular country. It's a human being story, and so is Sagan's. He doesn't, and that actually goes to the next question: where was it made? He made it all over the world and all over,
Right. Yeah.
technically,
Yeah.
the galaxy and the
Right.
universe. But it was something very necessary at the time, and I think that's why it got so much attention, because it was done so well and was done with such a focus on what we can achieve and what we can do if we look at each other as one big family, every now and then.
Right. Right. And I think that combination hit a nerve. It really did hit a nerve with people. I mean, Cosmos was the first science book to sell over 500,000 copies.
Yeah.
Yeah, New York Times said it was a watershed moment for science-themed television.
Yeah.
And it spent, depending on which list you look at, a year or more on the bestseller list.
Right.
That's
something. Yeah, that's definitely, and that's not, because and maybe modern audiences are not as familiar with how important that is, just because we have, there's entire channels devoted to science on, cable, and there's entire, it's a component. There's countless documentaries. There's so many, scientific minds that are like celebrities now. Neil deGrasse Tyson, comes to mind, or even like just like the Beaker type scientists, like Bill Nye the Science Guy, and those kinds of, but that wasn't really the case back. You had Mr. Wizard, with like, making small experiments in his kitchen, and that was pretty much it, right? I mean, there wasn't like in media, in pop media, there wasn't a lot going on.
There really wasn't. And of course,
go ahead. Go, your turn. I was just gonna say.
Go ahead. I was just gonna say, and of course, Neil deGrasse Tyson was majorly influenced by Sagan. He met him when he was a kid, got an autograph. And Bill Nye took a class, an astronomy class with Carl Sagan, and
so that's part of his legacy is these other people that present science in a relatable way. It should be pointed out that the series aired between September and December of 1980, the first semester of all levels of school. This says something about the intended audience, as the pattern of the new school year, with its fresh minds eager to take on information throughout the fall, had been established in Western culture for a long time. And speaking of Western culture and society, if Star Wars brought a society that had grown disinterested in space exploration back to looking at the stars, albeit through fiction, Carl Sagan accomplished the job not of bringing people back down to Earth, per se, but tying the two worlds together. They have always been connected, after all, but through Cosmos, Sagan eloquently demonstrates this fact over and over again. It's the ultimate answer to the biggest, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Question that people have ever asked. And the evidence that people were asking it in the late 1970s is written all over the era. So one of the things I can also think about with this time period of the 70s into 80s is we were, as a globe, on the crest of a wave of huge achievement when it came to science and technology. Apple computers had just come about. The personal computer was just a few years away, and for example, I just sent you effortlessly a link,
right?
Through the channels of I don't know how many satellites were involved just now with me sending you something, and now we're talking as if we're in the same room. It's
right,
and we don't even think twice about it. And how many people of all ages are constantly using the internet, in the palm of our hands, and are just like not even thinking twice about how marvelous that is. And I think if Carl Sagan was still with us, he would probably have regular programs reminding us just how, not shaming us, not trying to, put us down or any way, but just being like, hey, just so you know, there's like so much brain power behind that. There's so much human evolution of, thought. And, I think about like that episode where he compares the exploration of the stars with, the Dutch and the colonialism and things, and kind of, it's the same spirit that drove both. It's not, exclusive to any one time period, but, we are using with such ease nowadays technology that has, in some cases, hundreds of years behind it in development. And that was really about to lift off around 1980.
Right. In many ways it did. And I think it was a conjunction of these things. The success of, the science fiction franchise, the launches of the, science fiction franchises of both Star Wars and Star Trek. The people that were, being influenced, who were kids during Apollo.
Right.
Who came up or during the early days. Homer Hickam comes to mind.
Yeah.
We've seen October Sky, but there's, and not to mention like just thousands or tens of thousands of, people you never hear of who have, gone on to play roles in advancing science.
Absolutely. And that's, one of the things that I oftentimes remind myself of when I do this program, and my guests do a good job of reminding me too, is that people do get older. What was applicable to you, what interested you as a child, first of all, it doesn't go away, but you tend to mature with it. And so that's a really good point, that the space program of the 60s that was getting 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds excited and interested in that kind of stuff, those who stuck with it, this is their next chapter as their young adulthood. And that takes it to the next question nicely, is who's the intended audience or user of this? And so 500 million people worldwide have seen Cosmos. It's applicable to all, but when it was made, he wasn't directing it towards, it was the layman's version of science, right? Without dumbing it down.
Right. And so I think you hit on it, is that the audience is everyone.
Right.
All right. For the most part, I swear this is not just a complete non sequitur. I am going to wrap around to the question. For the most part, kids don't have to go to the gym on their schedule twice a week.
Right.
They don't have to think of exercising. They play.
Right.
And when playing, they're riding their bikes, they're running, they're playing stickball, whatever those crazy kids are doing these days, right? And they get exercise naturally by doing what they enjoy. And I think that if you can make it so that even the so-called reluctant learner enjoys the show, enjoys the media, enjoys the game, whatever, you can have a scientific basis behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And Star Trek was famous for that. I mean, that show inspired, generations of rocket scientists.
Right. Yeah.
And most of the science makes sense. Sometimes it's better than Star Wars for that,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know that I remember watching a whole program one time about the impact of Star Trek in pop culture, and then also how it influenced science. And they showed all the technology. And so this show was made probably about 20 years ago. And so they were talking about how the communicators on Star Trek are our modern day cell phones, and that somebody watching that show is like, I want that for real. It's like bridging the gap themselves of saying, okay, it's fantasy here. It's I want to make it actually happen, and I'm going to put the work in, and I'm going to, become a scientist in order to make what I enjoy on television come to life and to be real and usable. And I think that's what makes Star Trek separate from the Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica and all those other contemporaries, is because it was more possible. Not all the creatures and not all of the, but it was like the things that they were using seemed to have more like, yeah, we could actually make that. Now
compromises were made.
Right. I also think about things like Jurassic Park that, 15 years after Cosmos, Jurassic Park is inspiring a whole generation of paleontologists, people that, who are growing up and watching movies. And I would say probably just the original Jurassic Park. The subsequent ones get really out of hand. Yeah. But the original one is pretty faithful to the book. Not exactly, but it's pretty close, and has like that moment where Dr. Grant first sees the thing he's been studying his entire, and he sees the dinosaur, and he just his jaw drops, and he's just like, it's almost like if Carl Sagan actually did go to Mars and got to experience what that was like.
Right.
And so that's the moment. I think that's where they got the kids, right? That's where they got these young people. They're like, oh, like I can only imagine. I want to study, dinosaurs. That's what I want to do. My own son, it's one of his options. For Halloween, he just went as a Jurassic Park scientist. Oh
my God, that's great.
Yeah, so he made his own costume, and people thought he was a cowboy, but then they saw the insignia on his shirt, and so they're like, oh, you're a doctor, and he had his DNA, with he had like paperwork that had all the dino DNA written on it.
Right.
So when he talks about what he wants to do when he grows up, he has a list, and it always includes dinosaur scientists. And I'm like, that would not likely have been on his list had it not been for Jurassic Park. So media does really have a lot to do, with inspiring, in this case, science. And so going back to Sagan's work, the intended audience being such a broad one, he wanted everybody to watch this and enjoy it, and they did. And think about, and so you yourself, that's how we got you here, because you were saying that that's the show that did it for you.
Oh, absolutely. His ability, what he did was revolutionary. We talked about it a little bit, like he brought the audience to Mars. He brought the audience to the moon, or back in time, to the Paleolithic era, wherever. And what I'm trying to do now, my big vision, I'm starting to unfold, is using 3D technology and interactive avatars and AI all together, merging them together, so that not only can you appear to be standing on the moon, but you can walk around the moon.
Okay, so it's not just not just a blank, background, but
Right. And you can, learn, go to a lava planet. I'm still in the works. You can go to a lava planet soon, where you can walk around and, learn about geology and exoplanets from talking rocks.
right.
Last weekend when this was recorded, Halloween just passed. And last weekend, we had a haunted lunar base available for people to come out. And next week, I'm actually going to do something in there in 3D space for Carl Sagan's birthday coming up on the 9th of November.
That would be now just thinking to myself, that'd be a good time to put this podcast out. I'm at I like timing as much as possible, but so essentially what you're saying is all of these innovations that you want to do to get astronomy to remain relevant and interesting to people, and is based in the way that this program did it for you, is to show you. Over the years, Cosmos has been updated a little bit. They've added more animations to it. They've made some additional things. What do you think about that? Do you think it needed that, or was it fine the way it was back in 1980?
They say you should never remake a movie that was done well the first time.
Yeah.
Ocean's 11 being the obvious exception to that rule. Both versions of that film are great.
Yeah.
But I do certainly appreciate what they did with the remake, and I have nothing but admiration for Neil deGrasse Tyson, who has been on The Cosmic Companion.
Yeah.
Once before.
Oh yeah. I wouldn't mind picking your brain on how you got him on there. That's pretty great. That must have been a thrill, because like you said, he's an extension of that Sagan legacy. Because what I'm thinking is, and it's so funny, we keep going back to Star Wars, that is
the way.
It's like, because they did the same thing with Star Wars, didn't they? They had a perfectly fine trilogy of movies, and then as a way to update it and to get a new audience interested again, they threw in a bunch of 3D animations and background stuff, little Easter eggs,
and made sure that it was clear Han did not shoot first.
Right.
Han shot first.
I know and that is not to be overlooked at how important that is, because in 1977 you need a rogue, you need this rebel, you need this actual pirate that you're like, wow, that guy is. I'm glad he's on our side, at least for now. Whereas by the time you get to the 90s and they change it around, it's like the same thing when they took the guns out of the police officers in ET, and replaced them with walkie-talkies. They're like, no, leave it the way it is, because it's a document of the time it was made, not, don't clean it up. But I'm thinking I'm sure the reason why they tried to include more of the visuals for Cosmos is because they were afraid that it was going to be not received by an audience, a younger audience, in particular in the 90s and beyond, if it was still with the same early 80s, late 70s, early 80s animations and graphics and stuff like that. But I don't know. I sometimes I go back and forth on things like that. Like you said, if it's fine the way it is, leave it alone. Don't feel the need to update. Don't do sequels. Don't, if it's, just leave it as it is, and
some sequels were better. I mean, let's face facts. Wrath of Khan was 1,000 times better than, watching them approach the Enterprise for 15 minutes in the first movie.
Right. Which is the one where they go to San Francisco and they travel through time? That was 4.
Voyage Home, yeah.
That was always fun. I mean, kind of ridiculous, but I like that one because it was just like, for the same reasons that I think that, where we're at with this, and, if I can extend it maybe a little bit too far, but I think it's people like time travel movies, not so much when we go to places outside of our reach, but when we stay within our own lifetimes, I mean, this is 80s is also the time of Quantum Leap, where, Sam is going from, 20th century only. There's only a few episodes where he gets left out of a different time period. And this is actually, man, I'm just full of segues, another New Hampshire product, by the way, but I'm just full of segues here. I was thinking,
speaking of New Hampshire, no.
right, because we always are, and and science and inventions, but the segue I was thinking is, this Cosmos was only in this country anyway, out viewed by something that came out 10 years later on PBS, and that would be the Civil War. And that for me, so I'm so glad that we're talking about this, because for me, that was my inspiration. I grew up really loving history, and I was so grateful to live in New England so I could go see a lot of historic sites as a kid. And then it was when Ken Burns' Civil War came on, I was just I was enthralled. I was watching it along with the rest of the country. And it was almost like, and so if I'm not mistaken, I think that's right around the time in Quantum Leap, when the one time that he goes outside of his own lifetime or the timeline of the 20th century is when he goes to the Civil War. And I want to say it's because the Civil War for a short time, right around 1990, was becoming chic again. It was like, it was pop again. But I think that documentary was, even though it was completely different topic, completely different style of documentary making than Cosmos, it served a very similar purpose. And that was to make, like a ordinary person look at this, not talk down to them, not treat them like imbeciles, but rather say, this is important that you know this, right? We want to make sure that, of all the periods in history that you understand, this is a very important thing, so it never happens again, so let's reflect on this. And, for those very similar reasons. And there's an obvious reason why globally Cosmos still stays as number one, because most of the world doesn't really have as much interest in the American Civil War as Americans do. But it's the same, it's coming from the same place, literally PBS, as well as figuratively, as like, we are making these programs not to wag our finger at you, a lecturing teacher kind of thing, but rather as saying, you're connected to this. Right. We're all in this together. And I really think that's the behavior that both those programs share, and they both convey that. It's not right. So would you say that Cosmos, the book, as well as the so with science series, the last question I have is, prescriptive versus descriptive. Prescriptive, of course, meaning it wants you to think a certain way, you feel a certain thing, do something, whereas descriptive is just describing. It's definitely a good combination of both, wouldn't you say? That it's not, because if it was just descriptive, like you said before, it'd be a pretty dull show. But because he's trying to get you to evoke certain emotions by watching it, it has a level of prescription. Would it have been nearly as inspiring and successful, and starting with you, because like you said, this was a big inspiration for you, if it was purely descriptive? It was just, here are the planets and this is what we know about them.
Right. And that's what we're talking about with Sagan's ability to build bridges over that chasm between scientists and ordinary people.
Yeah.
Now, if I remember the first chapter of Cosmos, he talked about the Great Library of Alexandria.
Yeah.
And I just remember being enthralled with that when I first read it, and probably several times after. And when I was it like, I was 9 years old or something at the time, I became obsessed with the idea of reading an entire book about the Library of Alexandria. I went to the bookstore, they checked, and they said, no, this, not only do we not have one, we don't think there's ever been one published.
Oh, really?
And
that's very ironic, actually, that a library burning isn't in a library or a bookstore.
Isn't that odd?
Yeah.
So I became obsessed with, not obsessed, but I fell in love with the idea of writing such a book myself.
Yeah.
And that was actually my first book, was called The Light of Alexandria. And, it covered history and such of the Library of Alexandria, as well as, it's basically, as well as the events going on around the scientists at the time, the music they were listening to, the food they were eating, the poetry they were reading. I think that, and that's it's just like one of the big things for me, but it's just like one of the, millions of, byproducts of Cosmos and of Sagan.
It's very slipstream, it's very much like kind of, he's flying by on his, vehicle of Cosmos, and then we get caught up in, the wind that comes from that. And it's very powerful what you just said, actually, that he planted a seed with you that said, all right, I'm going to cover this. I'm going to let you know something you've never known before. And now you're going to go and write a book about it yourself, because, and I can't get over just how similar our experiences are with Cosmos and the Civil War, because I was 9 years old when that premiered. And so it's a very, I think, important age for children, to your last single digit year, you're getting ready for the big one, you're getting ready for 1-0,
the big 1-0.
And you get to, and you're not a little kid by any means, but you're also not a big kid, and so you kind of have that the world is before you attitude of like, I can look at it, and that's exactly how I felt with, we should definitely use this opportunity to sing the praises of PBS, because
PBS is wonderful.
And Fred Rogers in particular, because it was previously, I think it was in the 70s, that PBS almost went off the air because it wasn't getting, at least the Corporation Public Broadcasting wasn't getting enough funding, and it was about to go under. And I remember seeing, at least from the, I'm sure there's other testimonials too, but I remember seeing from the Mr. Rogers documentary, he testifying in front of Congress, saying how important it is to have public broadcasting as an educational alternative to the other stuff that's on television, kind of the lower culture type stuff. And had that not happened, then we might not have actually been able to get Carl Sagan's Cosmos, at least not on public television, where it really belongs, right? I mean, that kind of programming has a home on PBS, doesn't it?
It really does. PBS is magnificent, and we could spend an entire show singing the praises of Fred Rogers.
Yeah.
I want to be his neighbor. If I'm going to be honest, I really want to be his neighbor.
Yeah, me too. I mean, when I was watching that documentary, and then to a lesser extent with the Tom Hanks portrayal of him, but especially the documentary, I was actually moved to tears while watching that in the theater, the documentary, because I was just like, that was my youth. I grew up, and I watched other stuff. Like I said before, I watched Wheel of Fortune when I was a kid. I watched, looking back, and I watched quite a bit of TV actually, but I watched, the cartoons. I wasn't, shielded from that, but I loved Sesame Street. I loved Fred, I loved Mr. Rogers. I loved all those, PBS programming for kids. I watched Nova,
Nova's fantastic.
It's like, because it was there, and I could, even as a young kid, you could tell it was a cut above everything else. Like, there was care, there was interest put into it. It wasn't just something that was churned out, for the sake of making, lots of money or something like that. It was, public TV at its best, I suppose.
Right.
So, I mean, what a great document I'd say Cosmos is for that time period. It's one that's oftentimes overlooked. Nowadays, you hear a lot about the late 70s, early 80s contemporarily, especially with economic similarities between our current time period with inflation,
Reaganomics.
and the responses to it and stuff like that, is very similar. And I don't know, I think in some way, I mean, things tend to go cyclical and repeat itself. Would you say that we could, as a society, right now, or really at any time, could we use another Cosmos type,
we can
transcendent show like that?
Oh, we can always use another Cosmos. I think the more every child is a natural born scientist. They ask the questions, why is the sky blue? How does my stomach work? What's that big bright thing in the sky? And we have many adults, far too many adults, lose that sense of wonder.
Yeah.
When they get older. And the more we can reignite that flame,
right,
that light of science, the better off we're going to be. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
Sagan used to say something along the lines, I'm only paraphrasing here, that, we live in a world which is more dependent than ever on science and technology. And at the same time, where, too many people are losing sight of sight of science, and
it's, I think a
really
lot of
dangerous.
It is because
really,
I think a lot of folks. I think a lot of folks kind of they think science equals people in lab coats in laboratories looking through microscopes and things like that. Where it's like, and this is what Sagan. For some reason I have this image in my head, and I'm sure it's from Cosmos of Carl Sagan walking on the beach. I know that's in there somewhere, and if it's not there, if it's not there, it's also in the movie that Contact, right? His story, and there's that whole part where Jodie Foster's character ends up on a beach, and she meets her dad, right? I think, or it's like an alien kind of portraying, in a recognizable form. But anyway, I think about that, and I'm like, that's science. Right. Walking in nature. Like I love living, again, I'm on the seacoast of New Hampshire. So I love going to the beach. And, when you're looking outwards at the ocean, and you have human civilization behind you and all you have in front of you is nature. I'm like, that's science. Is like both sides of it. But, when I'm looking out there, that's the natural world, and trying to figure out man's place in that natural world is science. It's not necessarily somebody who has a whole chalkboard of, different kinds of math equations and problems that we can't possibly, figure out what they're trying to say. It is, you scoop up, sand, and you have how many worlds in your hand, there are, it's a powerful thing. And
it really is.
I'm really so glad that he brought that to us at that level at that time.
Right. It was absolutely amazing.
I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about this. And I'm glad we were able to connect over, even if my video isn't working. I swear I set up the background on Zoom, that celestial one that looks like has like the planet Earth from outer space and everything was going to be my background. And I can't, speaking of science, I got to figure out this camera, why it's not working.
that's technology.
Right. I think it has something to do with my Wi-Fi connection. Like if it's not strong enough, it doesn't even bother trying to get the camera going because it knows it'll probably crash or whatever. But regardless, this is an audio podcast, so it's not going to be a huge thing if they don't see my face on it. But I really appreciate James Maynard for coming by the EPS podcast. And where can people best find you and your podcast?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me on, Eric. It was a fabulous time. Great way to kill a little.
Yeah.
Great conversation, you know. But I encourage everyone to come check out what we're doing at the cosmiccompanion.net. They're going to find a nearly weekly show that we put on, the Cosmic Companion, and you have access to all kinds of cool things, including our new 3D lunar base and
that is
more.
Incredible. That sounds like so much fun. And I was looking at your most recent podcast and listening to about the death in space.
Yeah, it was a fun episode. That was a fun episode to make.
But and there's just like my program, I mean, actually more so for yours, it's endless. I mean, the universe is ever expanding, so you'll never have lack of content for your program. There's always something to talk about, and absolutely with this too. So thank you again, James, for joining the EPS podcast, and thank you all for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything, including Carl Sagan's Cosmos, is a primary source. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you, Eric. Take care.
You too. I have been celebrating 1 year of the Everything is a Primary Source podcast this week, and I'd like to thank you for taking part by listening. Please follow and share the podcast on social media, especially Instagram, and consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/EPS podcast. There you can reap the benefits such as t-shirts, stickers, and coffee mugs, and depending on the tier, dictate the topics of future episodes. If nothing else, you can feel satisfied that you helped an independent podcaster produce more content for everyone's enjoyment. When we get back to our regular schedule next week, full-length episodes like this one are being delivered on Thursdays, while shorter episodes, the products of my EPS Podcast live exhibits, come out on Tuesdays. I look forward to you tuning in again to the EPS Podcast, where everything is a primary source.